The idea that Tezin had been stealing from Zack was not entirely surprising to Zorian. For one thing, he'd known for quite a while that Zack and Tezin did not get along, what with Zack occasionally thrashing the man at the beginning of the restart for no apparent reason. For another, Zack had explicitly told Zorian in one of the restarts that he did not approve of how Tezin had been managing his properties. It did not take some great genius to see that this was more than just a simple difference in opinion. Theft was one of several explanations that Zorian had considered as a possible explanation, but he could never quite figure out why Tezin would risk his reputation for what was surely just pocket change to someone of his stature. As it turned out, Zorian had been thinking too small. Tezin wasn't siphoning some money off the Novita's accounts here and there, he just plain went after everything they had. Surprisingly brazen. What kind of forces stood behind Tezin that would allow him to be so shameless about abusing the trust he was given? What kind of machinations and political maneuvering had compelled the royal family to assign such a hostile caretaker to the last surviving member of a house that had been so loyal to them in the past? All in all, when Zorian had asked Tinami to tell him more about Zack's caretaker and his looting of House Novita's properties, he'd expected quite a story. Something lengthy, complex, and dramatic. What he got instead was a rather underwhelming tale of simple greed and corruption. The appointment of Tezin to the position of Zack's caretaker was completely devoid of controversy at the time the decision was made. Tezin was the patriarch of noble House Sveri, who had been close allies of House Novita, and his reputation had been quite good at the time. Thus, when Tezin nominated himself for the position of Zack's caretaker, few people had any objections. He was a high-ranking nobleman, a powerful mage and an ally of the house that he was supposed to care for, who could really contest his appointment. Unfortunately, Tezin's greed turned out to be stronger than his sense of obligation or respect for his deceased allies. From the moment he had acquired the rights to manage the Novita's property, Tezin wasted no time in abusing them as much as possible. Most of their property ended up being sold to members of House Sveri at laughably low prices, and the profits made from those sales largely went to Tezin himself in the form of exorbitant caretaker fees that he paid himself for doing such a fine job at managing things. And nobody protested about that? Zorian asked incredulously. The crown? I heard House Novita were big allies of the royal family. Or one of the Novita's many vassal families and contractors. They must have had some power and they surely couldn't have liked what Tezin was doing. Or hell, other noble houses, at least some of them must have felt sympathetic to Zack's cause. House Novita was indeed a close ally of the crown, Tinami confirmed. But so is House Sveri. And unlike noble House Novita, noble House Sveri survived the upheavals largely intact. For the crown to go after Tezin would have meant alienating one of their major remaining allies at a time where they could ill afford to do so. I suspect the crown was unpleasantly surprised by Tezin's behavior, but decided to look the other way out of practicality. She paused for a second, frowning slightly as she considered things. Plus, I hear Tezin generously donated some of the artifacts and funds from the Novita's treasury to the crown, she eventually continued. Actually, he was rather generous about spreading the Novita's wealth around in general. I imagine that's how he quieted most of the criticism. I see, Zorian hummed thoughtfully. They have their slice of the pie, so now they're no longer inclined to protest too much. Still, if Tezin had been as blatant about things as you said, you'd think that somebody would have tried to do something. Some people just don't care about money. Or at least not enough to let something like this go unchallenged. Ah, well, I make it sound really obvious, but it's really not, Tinami said. The truth is that Tezin was always going to end up selling off a lot of Novita properties and halting many of their activities, even if he had been acting in good faith. The problem was more about who he sold things to and at what prices. He was supposed to slim down noble House Novita to a strong, manageable core. Instead, he used virtually all of their wealth to enrich his family and further his political career, leaving only a tiny sliver to Zack. But that's not something that is immediately obvious to casual inspection. You would have to launch an investigation into the matter to prove anything, and that would give Tezen plenty of time to mobilize his connections and shut you down before you get anywhere. Well, if it actually took some digging to realize what Tezen had done, then that would certainly help explain some things. Such as why none of their other classmates seemed to know about Zach's situation. Most of them were terrible gossips, so if Zach's situation was widely known, Zorian would have known about it too by now. Though really, considering how readily Tinami was telling him all this, he wondered how it was possible that she'd never told this to the rest of their class. He decided to just ask her about it. Well, if we were having this talk a year ago or so, I wouldn't have told you all this, Tinami told him. Back then we had Zach in our class, and I wouldn't have wanted to say anything before talking to Zach about it. But now Zach is no longer in our class, so it doesn't matter anymore. Ah, yes, since Zach fled Scioria at the beginning of the restart, just like he always did in recent restarts, it made sense to assume he had given up on the academy. His poor showing during their first 2 years of education probably made the theory even more plausible than it would otherwise be. He wondered whether Zach had known what Tezen had done to his inheritance before the time loop. He had a hunch the answer was no, since nothing about Zach's pre-loop attitude indicated that he was in any way concerned about his future or angry at his guardian, but he could be wrong. Maybe Zach was a very good actor. How much do you think Zach knows about all of this? Zorian asked Tinami. I don't know, she said. I only tried to sound him out once, and I guess I was too oblique because he thought I was hitting on him. Zorian couldn't help it. He laughed. It's not funny, she protested. After several more minutes of questions and answers, Zorian found out that Tinami couldn't really give him any details about Zach's situation. She knew about the situation in general terms, but the specifics were understandably hard to come by. The conversation did, however, give Zorian an idea what if Zach wasn't the only one that had happened to. Oh yes, that sort of thing is not exactly a rare occurrence, Tinami said when he shared the notion with her. A lot of weakened houses and smaller families ended up being dismembered like that in the aftermath of the Splinter Wars and the Weeping. Most countries had too many things on their plate to go after every shady thing that was happening, especially if the people doing the dismembering were closely aligned with the government or some other powerful faction. In fact, compared to the fates of some other heirs, Zach is fairly lucky. Some of them were quite literally looted of everything they had. Once their caretakers were done with their properties, they were basically thrown out on the streets with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The Novitas are still a noble house though, so Tezen couldn't really go that far. He needed to have some smokescreen in case someone started throwing accusations. So Zach still has his mansion and can live off a healthy trust fund, and Tezen can point to that if somebody tries to charge him with anything. Interesting. Zorian highly doubted that Zach wanted to see Scioria burn to the ground just because the city's leadership was complicit in the looting of his house. The other boy seemed too good-natured for that, but he could totally imagine some of the other, less fortunate and thus less forgiving individuals wanting to strike back at the people who had profited at their expense. No matter who'd get caught in the crossfire. Could Red Robe be one of the people in that position? That would help explain why the other time traveler seemed to want Scioria destroyed so badly. Well, he had no way to confirm that, so that would remain just an idle thought for now. Though, once he opened the Matriarch's memory packet, he should probably try to track down those kinds of people living in Scioria and check up on them. Just in case. His talk with Tinami did not last long after that. They both had things they needed to be doing, and he was getting the impression that Tinami was starting to get a little suspicious of Zorian's fixation on the topic. Surprisingly, she wanted to meet with him again, or maybe not so surprisingly, since she implied she wanted to ask a favor of him. After agreeing to another meeting, Zorian said goodbye to the girl and went back home. The moment he arrived back at the house, he realized he had stepped into pandemonium. After coming back to Amaya's place, he found that Capriva had dropped by and brought the alchemical ingredients Kale had asked for. Normally that would be excellent news, but it turned out that her timing had been somewhat unfortunate. Capriva had already met Kiriel, but not Kana. Kale didn't want their classmates to know he had a daughter, so he had kept her out of sight the last time Capriva had come over. But Kale wasn't there, and Kiriel couldn't keep a secret if her life depended on it, so when Capriva asked Kiriel to introduce her friends, she thought nothing of revealing Kana's true identity. At that point the rest of the household got involved, with Kale freaking out and trying to convince Capriva to keep Kana's existence a secret, Kiriel repeatedly trying to apologize to Kale, Capriva being visibly amused, and Amaya trying to run damage control. Amusingly, it turned out that Taven hadn't known Kana was Kale's daughter either. She just sort of assumed she was Amaya's daughter, despite her having the same sort of vivid blue eyes that her father had, and never sought confirmation about it from anyone. Sadly, everyone was too caught up in the drama to pay attention to the packet of alchemical ingredients that Capriva had brought over. Well, everyone except Nachka. She decided that this mysterious packet was very interesting and worthy of examination. Unfortunately, either Capriva had failed to secure the ingredients properly or Nachka had examined the package too enthusiastically, because she managed to breathe in a bit of hallucinogenic dust from the package and started losing control over her form. Her eyes became slitted like a cat, she grew a tail and claws and started hissing at people who tried to examine her to see what was wrong. That started the second round of drama, with Ray being upset that her daughter was basically outed as a shifter and that Capriva had left dangerous substances within reach of children, Capriva trying to defend herself, Kiriel assuring Ray that it's okay because she already knew her friend can turn into a kitty, Ray being angry at Nachka for being so indiscreet, and poor Amaya playing peacemaker for the second time that day. At this point Zorian had come back from his talk with Tinami and was told what happened in his absence. "I was only gone for a couple of hours," Zorian complained. "Damn, you people work fast." He was immediately faced with a plethora of unamused looks. "Okay, look," he said placatingly. "I think you're all making mountains out of molehills here. First of all, I'm pretty sure Capriva has no intentions of spreading rumors about Kana amongst the student body, mostly because he'd read her mind to make sure. And I don't think anybody here really minds Ray and Nachka being shifters, either. What makes you think I'm a shifter as well? She could have inherited it from her father for all you know," Ray protested, folding her hands over her chest. Zorian ignored her remark. "Really, the only semi-serious issue was that Nachka ended up drugged," said Zorian. "I swear I secured the package properly," Capriva mumbled. "Nachka probably punctured something with her claws," Ray admitted with a sigh. "She likes to use her claws to remove wrappings and such. Nevertheless, the package was here because of me and Kale, but that's beside the point. The point is, I feel somewhat responsible for what happened. What do you think would be an appropriate compensation for this?" "Oh, there is no need began Ray, only to get cut off by her own daughter. "I want a doll," Nachka slurred. The effects of the alchemical dust she breathed had faded, but were still far from gone. "Like the one Kiri has." "She said you made it." "I made a doll for Kiri?" Zorian asked, before he realized what Nachka was referring to. "Oh wait, you mean Kostyenka. That's technically not a doll, but whatever. Assuming your mother agrees, I don't see the problem with that. Is this doll going to explode if treated roughly?" Ray asked suspiciously. "Not an unreasonable fear. Some magical items held a substantial amount of mana inside of them and could thus easily detonate if handled roughly. In this particular case, though, that would never happen." He didn't trust Kiriel around explosives any more than Ray trusted Nachka around the same. "No, it will just stop being animated," Zorian said. "The golem is powered by ambient mana and made mostly out of wood, so there is nothing in there that could explode if it breaks." "Then no, I have no objections," Ray shrugged. "Though really, this is quite unnecessary. Nachka is just milking this for all it's worth and I wouldn't blame you at all for simply telling her off." "Mom!" Nachka whined. "You're supposed to be on my side." Zorian was distracted from the spectacle by a burst of emotion coming from Kana. The little girl was fidgeting like crazy in Kale's lap, clearly waging some internal war with herself. Though she was as silent as ever, Zorian could feel through his empathy that her attention was squarely on him. She wanted to tell him something. "Let me guess, you want a doll too?" Zorian said, taking a wild guess at what was bothering her. Kana nodded so fast her head looked like it was going to fall off. A round of laughter from everyone present followed that exchange. All right, Zorian sighed. "I get it. 2 new golem dolls coming up. I'll be busy in the near future, but they should be done over the weekend." Now that he thought about it a little bit, this sort of development wasn't that surprising. Kiriel had been making both girls jealous of her new toys for a whole week now, so it made sense that they'd want one of their own if they thought they could get away with it. They were probably just too polite to ask for one in previous restarts, or simply couldn't think of a good way to ask. "Damn it, now I'm getting a little jealous," Capriva groused. "Why don't I get a doll too?" "You're too old to play with dolls," Zorian told her, rolling his eyes. "You can play with Kizjenka when you visit," Kiriel offered. "Ah," Capriva grinned, ruffling Kiriel's hair. "You're a sweet kid. It's hard to believe you're related to someone like Zorian." "Hey. Brother is really great," Kiriel protested, pushing Capriva's hand away from her hair so she could straighten it back into place. "He's like a hedgehog. He gets nice once you get past his prickliness." Ugh. And they were just getting started, too. After completely defusing a tense situation and promising to make expensive toys for a couple of little girls. Truly no good deed goes unpunished. Friday came, and with it Zorian's next meeting with Svim. This time, however, Svim didn't want to hold their session inside his office. Instead, he led Zorian to a restricted training ground he had reserved for the day. They would be doing serious magic, Svim claimed, so his office was no longer sufficient for their purposes. "I have talked to some astronomers since we last met," Svim began, unlocking the door of the training ground and shooing him inside. "I have nothing conclusive yet, but the results thus far are not encouraging. There have been no significant deviations among the celestial bodies. Additionally, the planets in particular are being closely watched because of the upcoming planetary alignment. It is unlikely they are illusionary. The affected area likely includes the entire solar system. Provided it is, in fact, limited by area," Zorian pointed out. "Yes," Svim agreed easily. "That is true. However, while my forays into astronomy have met with rather disappointing results, I've found something interesting while researching time magic." "Tell me, have you ever heard of black rooms?" "What, the ones that let you spend several years inside while only a day passes outside? Those actually exist?" Zorian asked incredulously. "No, those ones are definitely fake," Svim said, shaking his head. "But ones that can stretch a day into a month do. And the interesting thing is how they achieve that kind of extreme time dilation effect. Time magic has sharp limits in how effective it can get. Even the most powerful hasting effects can only speed up time 4 to 5 times before they hit a wall. At that point, no matter how powerful and skillful the mage is, the boundary between two temporal flows starts to unravel. So how can black rooms speed up time by a factor of 30, then?" Zorian frowned. "By isolating them from the rest of the world," Svim said. "That's why they're called black rooms. They have to completely enclose the area and seal it off. This greatly lessens the stress of the temporal boundary, but it also makes it impossible to interact with people outside while the black room is working. Once the time dilation is engaged, nothing goes in or out until the effect is broken. Material supplies, magical communication, nothing goes through. Even contact with the spiritual planes is blocked." Zorian frowned. "I see. So there is precedence for powerful time magic to require an enclosed area to function properly. But from what I understand, the principles behind the black rooms would require the affected area to be literally enclosed in a physical box. The time loop is clearly a more advanced piece of magic than the black rooms," so it's likely it uses a more subtle method of sealing off the area of effect, Svim responded. I suppose, Zorian said, acknowledging the possibility. I'm curious, though, how come black rooms are such a mystery? I only knew of them as rumors up until this point. Surely Eldamar would not hesitate to use them openly if they're so effective. In addition to needing tremendous amounts of mana, black rooms are very difficult to use properly, Svim said. Due to the way they're cut off from the outside, one has to plan each use very carefully. If the organizers fail to account for something critical, the whole operation is essentially ruined, and a lot of time and mana has been wasted. Black rooms cannot be turned off and on at will, and the mana cost of an operation has to be paid in full at the start. I understand there is a lot of controversy surrounding the black rooms, with many people disputing their actual usefulness and claiming they're a huge waste of money. Some of the more spectacular failures associated with them do not help their reputation. Oh. Zorian asked, intrigued. Initially, black rooms could not prematurely terminate the time dilation field once it was turned on, said Svim. Once the black room was on, whoever was inside was stuck until the spell wore off. Zorian winced. Yeah, that had been bound to end poorly. At least one group died of thirst after an administrative mix-up caused the organizers to stockpile too little water into the area before activation. Another group almost died of starvation after some form of insect snuck into the food supply and managed to ruin most of it before the infestation was detected. Even if everything was done properly, you are still essentially imprisoning several people in a small, cramped space where they have no privacy and little to entertain themselves with. Fights were common, with several experiments culminating in a bloodbath. In one memorable case, the entire group managed to mutually kill each other off. There were literally no survivors once the black room finally opened. What about sending individuals? Zorian asked. Most people can't handle total isolation for long, Svim shook his head. Besides, it costs exactly the same to run a black room for one person as it does for several of them, and the more people you send in, the more work can get done. After that, Svim asked Zorian to demonstrate some of his flashier magic, mostly combat magic and landscape alterations, but also teleportation, which actually worked unimpeded within the training ground, unlike in most of Scioria. It made sense, considering Svim had told him during their last meeting that he intended to teach him dimensionalism. After a while, his mentor decided he'd seen enough and motioned him to stop. You seem to have no specialty that I can see, Svim said. Well, I guess my specialty are spell formulas, said Zorian. But that is not exactly something I can demonstrate quickly and at whim. Just as well, Svim said. I know comparatively little about spell formulas and would be ill-equipped to evaluate your skill in the field. I understand why so many mages are fascinated with spell formula, but I always found them to be somewhat distasteful myself, Svim said. They are a crutch, most of the time. With a proper mastery of a spell, you wouldn't need them. Right, Zorian scowled. He understood why someone obsessed with perfection in mana shaping would have low regard for magical aids that sidestepped the need for that, but there was more to spell formula than making spell rods and such. I'm not criticizing you, Mr. Kaczynski, Svim said. Just explaining my lack of interest in the discipline. You can go far if you really master your specialty. But enough of that. When I said you don't seem to have any specialty, I meant in regards to mana shaping fields. You seem to be a generalist when it comes to those, yes? I seek out whatever magic is relevant to me at the moment, said Zorian. But yes, in general I try to master a little bit of everything. As far as I can tell, the main reason people specialize is time constraints. I'm not quite immune to that, but I'm pretty sure I can get good at several fields instead of just one. The path of an archmage, Svim nodded. I approve. For someone in your situation, aiming for anything less would have been a waste. I'm glad I don't have to convince you of that, at least. Huh. Did Svim just praise him for something? In any case, this reminded him of something he had been wondering for quite a while. Are you an archmage? Zorian asked Svim. An archmage is not an official rank that someone assigns to a person, Svim said. It is simply a term for a mage who has mastered several fields of magic to such an extent that they could outdo a typical specialist mage when it comes to those fields. I suppose the term could be applied to me, but it would be shockingly arrogant of me to claim it on my own. One is only ever a real archmage when other people start referring to you as such, and not many people use that term to describe me. Then again, not many people know about me in the first place, and I prefer it that way. So that would be a yes, basically. Surprising that a person like that would be willing to work as a teacher at the academy. People like Svim were incredibly rare and in high demand. Then again, Svim did say he liked being an unknown, so perhaps a relatively quiet job like this one was just what he wanted. Do you have a specialty? Zorian asked. He figured that since Svim was in a relatively good mood at the moment, he might as well milk it for all it's worth and try to find out more about the man. Defense against magical attacks of all sorts, Svim said. I actually teach an advanced class on the topic in your 4th year of education. Of course, if one aims to defend against something, they must first get to know it. And thus, I have become familiar with many a type of magic. But let's get back to you, shall we? I have to say, for one aiming to become an archmage, your way of going about it is somewhat suboptimal. How so? Zorian frowned. For instance, your way of choosing which mana-shaping exercises to practice, Svim said. While practicing a wide selection of different exercises like you've been doing is certainly useful, it is not really the best avenue of approach for a generalist mage. You would have been better served by focusing on raw mana manipulation and sensing. Such basic shaping exercises are time-consuming and give no short-term benefits, but the cumulative effect of their mastery decreases the learning time of every spell and improves spellcasting in general. I haven't really heard about such shaping exercises, Zorian said, feeling a little lost. It's not something a specialist mage would care much for, Svim said. And most people who write books are specialists. Your age works against you here. Most people don't start dabbling in those exercises until they're much older, no matter how talented they are, so the people you spoke to probably didn't think you'd be interested in those. Young mages like you have plenty of low-hanging fruit with much faster payoff to amuse themselves with. Right. So what are we talking here exactly? Zorian asked. I'm drawing a blank as to what sort of raw mana manipulation I could be doing as an exercise. Well, one major deficiency I noticed in your skills is that you don't seem to perceive mana around you to any appreciable extent, Svim said. And I'm guessing your ability to perceive your personal mana flow is hardly any better than that of the rest of your classmates. For someone of biological age, that would be entirely adequate, if rather disappointing. In your case, it really is inexcusable. Zorian was tempted to ask whether it was inexcusable by Svim's standards or the more sane standards of the rest of the world. But he didn't. This was absolutely fascinating, and he had largely gone numb to Svim's barbs by now. From everything I've read, mana sensing is a rather advanced skill that even long-time mages struggle with. Yes, but you seem to be rather bad at it, even accounting for that, Svim noted. I'm guessing this is a consequence of spending so many years in Scioria, which is awash in ambient mana. It's good for training, certainly, but it instills a certain amount of wastefulness in young mages. Zorian didn't need empathy to notice the distaste on Svim's face when he said that. On top of that, it is very difficult to practice perception exercises in a place like this, Svim continued. The ambient mana suffuses everything, dulling your senses. It would be far better to practice mana sensing somewhere outside the city to start with. This training ground is specially warded to keep the majority of the ambient mana out of it. Did you notice that? No, Zorian admitted with a frown. Though now that Svim mentioned it. This is what I meant when I said your ability to sense mana is deficient, Svim said. You should have noticed it right away, the moment you stepped into the training ground. But no matter. That's why I'm here to help you overcome your many flaws and become the best you can be. In any case, while the exercises I'm about to teach you would be normally rather hard to practice outside of this training ground, you are capable of teleportation. I suggest you simply teleport into the countryside outside of the city when you want to work on your ability to sense mana. Now pay close attention to what I'm about to do. At the end of the session, Zorian was honestly feeling a little overwhelmed by Svim's program. While the man was less of an asshole in this restart, he was still a very demanding teacher who pulled no punches when he seriously taught people. He had ended up showing Zorian more than 20 exercises aimed at improving his ability to sense mana, both inside and outside of him, and he expected Zorian to work on them for several hours every single day. On top of that, Svim also showed him several exotic teleportation variants that Zorian was also expected to learn by their next meeting and gave him a deceptively simple shaping exercise related to dimensionalism. The exercise involved taking a random rock and trying to form a so-called dimensional boundary around it. Apparently, the formation of such a boundary was the first step in just about every piece of magic dealing with time and space. The teleportation spells he loved using so much formed a boundary like that around him every time he used them, and would fail instantly if something prevented the spell from creating it. Like a ward, for instance. Getting better at shaping the boundary could easily improve just about every dimensionalism spell he cared to cast in the future. The problem was that the dimensional boundary was completely invisible to normal senses, making the exercise really hard to practice. How do you create and shape something you can't see and can only vaguely feel via crude feedback your personal mana gives you? He didn't think he could get the hang of that exercise anytime soon. Of course, if his ability to sense mana, especially his personal mana, was on a higher level, the exercise would have instantly gotten a lot easier. Zorian was pretty sure Svim had only given him that exercise to drive the point home how important mana sensing was and how much his lack of skill there was holding him back. Ugh. Days went by quickly. Kale was still working on the Sudamir problem, but Zorian had plenty of things to hold his time, so he left his Morlock friend in peace. His attacks on Arania webs were restarted, though this time he was less ambitious and picked a bunch of minor webs instead of a relative juggernaut like the Burning Apex. Accordingly, his attacks went a lot better and his Arania memory reading skills got lots and lots of practice. Since he was already rooting through the memories of defeated Aranias, he decided to kill two birds with one stone by searching their minds for interesting mind magic skills. He found nothing really revolutionary, but every minor trick and variation of a known technique he learned from his fallen foes added up to something in the end. He met with Tinami again, like he agreed to. Like she hinted at in their last meeting, she wanted to ask him for a favor. Specifically, she wanted him to give her his family tree. A weird request, but apparently she was collecting that information from all of her classmates for a personal project. His cynical side insisted that this was a code name for secret AOP information gathering operation, but who knew really? Maybe she was just really interested in people's lineages in addition to spiders. In any case, Zorian saw no reason not to humor her and promptly cobbled up something for her in his notebook. The execution was a bit lacking, unfortunately, since his knowledge of his family tree was a bit sketchy. Especially on his mother's side, since she hated talking about her witch mother and anything related to her. Tinami didn't care about how sketchy it was, though. If anything, she seemed to be even more excited about it when she found out Zorian had a witch among his ancestors. Considering the origin of Noble House Aope, he probably shouldn't be surprised about that. Despite the incident with Capriva's alchemical supplies, Ray kept coming to Amaya's home and bringing Nachka along with her. If anything, Ree's friendship with Amaya seemed to have only become firmer in the wake of revelations about her shifter nature. Meanwhile, Nachka and Kana were proud owners of their own toy golems. Nachka had asked for her golem to be given a feminine form like Kazjenka's, and named it Rutvika, while Kana was a bit of a surprise in that she wanted her toy golem to look male and have white hair. Zorian had no idea what she called it, but Kiriel and Nachka seemed to have decided its name was Jaglanak amongst each other. In other news, Kana seemed to have realized that Zorian had some method of understanding her thoughts, because these days, whenever she wanted to have her desires known, she simply dragged him off from whatever he was doing so he could interpret for her. And here he'd thought she was a little angel. Turns out he just hadn't had anything she'd wanted up until now. Finally, as the end of the restart began to approach, Kale finally decided he'd run out of options. He asked Zorian to teleport him in the vicinity of Ayaska Mansion so he could try to analyze the soul trap. He didn't think that would accomplish much, but there was little else he could think of. Zorian agreed, and decided to take Taven along with them. Mostly because he intended to try to analyze the soul trap himself, from the perspective of a spell formula specialist rather than a soul mage, and he needed someone to defend them against the Iron Beaks and Winter Wolves patrolling the wilderness around the place. Taven had no objections, and even relished the chance to fight something, so they were off. They only stayed a short while, and Zorian had to break off his analysis to help Taven defeat the flock of Iron Beaks that had started to harass them, but it was enough for Kale to decide the whole thing was beyond him. Kale was very quiet and subdued after that. The next day he'd made an excuse to drag Zorian out of the house and asked him to teleport them to the north of Nyazov Dveri so he could visit his wife's grave. "We're here," said Kale, pointing at the small abandoned cottage just ahead of them. Finally, Zorian mumbled, breathing heavily. He felt sorry for Kale, he really did, but when Kale said the place was not far from the main road, he didn't quite think the Morlock boy meant this. An hour-long trek, uphill, along a bumpy, narrow forest path was not what Zorian would describe as not far. Also, how the hell was Kale not affected in the slightest by the journey? The boy didn't look all that fit to him. Once they reached the cottage, Zorian took a minute to catch some breath and looked around. Kale immediately went to the back of the building to tend to the two simple, earthen graves that stood there. Pretty isolated place, Zorian noted, wandering over to help Kale get rid of the grass and weeds that had completely overrun the place. "No offense, but why did you end up burying your wife here, of all places?" "I didn't have much choice back then," Kale said. "There was only one village in the vicinity, and they're very backwards, superstitious folk. They'd never let a witch and her daughter get buried in their cemetery along with their own dead. And even if I could make them accept it somehow, they'd just vandalize it the moment I wasn't looking." "Disgusting," Zorian frowned. "It's fine," Kale said, shaking his head sadly. "This was their home. It somehow feels appropriate for them to be buried here." "So this other grave?" began Zorian. "Freya," said Kale. "My mother-in-law, and also my teacher. She died just before Namra did." Namra, Zorian learned, was the name of Kale's deceased wife. The crude gravestones, that Kale had presumably made for them, said their last name was Tverinov. Apparently Kale had assumed their family name when he married Namra. That was pretty interesting. It was not unheard of for a husband to take on his wife's name, but it did not happen very often. Usually only civilians who somehow managed to marry into one of the houses did that. Then again, maybe it was a witch thing. He knew that one of the reasons his mother and grandmother did not get along was that mother decided to take father's family name instead of the other way around. Considering that mother's choice seemed very conventional in the grand scheme of things, his grandmother's objections had always seemed strange to him. They both stood there in silence for a while, not saying anything. Finally, after several minutes of comfortable silence, Kale spoke. "I'm sorry," Kale said suddenly. "For what?" Zorian asked curiously. "I wasted your time," Kale sighed. "What?" Zorian asked incredulously. "You just wanted to visit your wife's grave, there is nothing wrong with that." "No, I'm talking about Sudomir and his soul trap," Kale said. "I kept stalling for over 2 weeks and I have nothing to show for it. I should have given up long ago, but—" "Ah," said Zorian. He'd kind of figured out that wasn't going anywhere after the first week or so. "That. It's fine, really. Are you sure there is nothing new you can tell me?" "Nothing," Kale said, shaking his head. He then reached out into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small notebook. He handed it to Zorian. Here. I wrote down everything relevant I could think of into that notebook. Keep in mind that this is literally just me making wild speculations, though I have no way to know if anything I wrote there has any basis in reality. Right, said Zorian, pocketing it for the moment. There would be time to read it later. Still, even if it's just speculation, it's clearly not nothing. I guess, Kale said. But I still feel pretty useless. Why? Zorian asked curiously. He had known for a while that Kale was frustrated by his inability to offer help against Sudamir, but he never really understood why Kale felt so deeply about that. I don't know, admitted Kale. Maybe it reminds me of how Freya and Namra contracted the weeping, and I could do nothing except helplessly watch as they wasted away. Or maybe I'm overthinking things. I heard it's a bad idea to psychoanalyze oneself. Zorian couldn't help but wince visibly. Kale didn't often refer to his personal tragedy, so sometimes it was hard for Zorian to keep in mind how traumatic these deaths must have been for his Morlock friend. He had never lost anyone he personally cared about to the weeping, but he'd heard that those who fell to the disease suffered horribly before the end. It was at times like this that Zorian really understood how the specter of that epidemic still hung over many people's lives. It had only been a handful of years since the weeping, after all, and many people were still mourning their dead. I hope you don't think less of me for asking this, said Zorian. But how did you end up as a married father at 13, anyway? Kale burst into laughter. What? He asked, greatly amused. All these restarts and you never thought to ask me this before. Well, I never seemed to find a good opening to dash, Zorian fumbled, caught off guard by the rapid change in Kale's demeanor. Sometimes, Zorian, you're just too considerate, Kale said, shaking his head with a final chuckle. I'd have asked by the end of the third restart for sure if I was in your place. And by the way, you're off by 2 years. I was actually 15 when I got Kana. Zorian gave him a strange look. I'm older than I look, Kale explained. I'm 2 years older than the rest of our class, but Ilsa said that doesn't really matter. Huh. He'd never have guessed Kale was 2 years older than him. Anyway, Kale said. There is not much to say. My mother died in childbirth and my father resorted to alcoholism soon afterwards, so I learned to stay away from the house most of the time. The village children didn't want to associate with a Morlock, so I ended up wandering the wilderness a lot, looking for things to sell for extra cash. One day I stumbled upon Namra in the forest and she led me to this place to meet her mother. Eventually Freya found out about my situation and offered to take me in. I agreed, of course. What, you weren't scared away by rumors of witches making potions out of children's blood? Zorian asked jokingly. Well, the rumors also said Morlocks like me ate people, so I didn't put much stock in them, Kale said. Anyway, I soon found out that Freya's motives weren't entirely motivated by compassion. She wanted an heir, and Namra did not have much talent for magic. I thought witch magic was heavy on the potions and very light on anything that would require actual shaping skills, asked Zorian. It is, confirmed Kale. And Namra was still horrid for it. She didn't have the instincts or the mentality for it. Since Freya really didn't want her secrets to die with her, she needed to teach her magic to someone from outside the family. And she chose me, because well. Namra fancied you? Zorian guessed. Yes, Kale sighed. She actually made it an official condition for teaching if I wanted her magic, I had to marry her daughter. But really, I'd have agreed to marry Namra even if she didn't provide any incentive for me to do so. Kale spent the next half an hour telling Zorian small, inconsequential stories about his life in the cottage next to them. It seemed to help his mood immensely. Finally, he took a deep breath and signaled to Zorian that they should go back to Amaya's place before the inhabitants got worried. I have made no mention of Sudamir's soul trap in my research journals, Kale said suddenly, just as they were about to leave. If I ever ask you about him or the disappearing soul mages in the area, just lie to me. Say you have no idea what is happening or something. It's not like I can do anything about it, and it makes it completely impossible for me to focus on my work. I felt horrible these past few weeks, and I failed to get anything done on the alchemical side of things. Zorian stared at him for a second before nodding in agreement. Consider it done. The new restart began in the same manner as all of his previous restarts, with Kiriel mercilessly jumping on top of him to wake him up. Good morning, brother. Kiriel yelled on top of him. Morning, hey. With a simple act of will, Zorian seized Kiriel telekinetically and levitated her into the air. She stopped her customary morning greeting with a startled yelp, her hands grasping around her in a panicky attempt to find some sort of purchase and stop her ascent. She struggled in vain. Perhaps if she had been expecting Zorian to levitate her off of him, she could have grabbed onto something in time, but she had been caught completely by surprise and was entirely at his mercy. After a few moments of wild flailing, she seemed to realize this and pouted at him. That's not fair, she complained, looking down on him from her vantage point above him. Since when can you even do that? Zorian ignored the question, instead studying the magic he was using to levitate her with his mana perception. He was still a long way from mastering even the most basic forms of mana perception, but an entire month of Svim's tutelage was definitely showing its results. Even a rudimentary ability to sense his own mana flow helped immensely when performing unstructured magic like he was currently doing, allowing him to notice and correct minute flaws in his technique that would have otherwise destabilized the whole undertaking. It was somewhat embarrassing that he had neglected such a potent skill all this time, but maybe it was fortunate he had done so. It was Svim's guidance, as much as the shaping exercises themselves, that was responsible for his rapid growth in the skill, and he would have wasted a huge amount of time if he had tried to piece things together on his own. Taking advantage of his momentary distraction, Kiriel suddenly started struggling again, swiping at him with her hands in an attempt to reel herself back down. Zorian promptly floated her further up in the air, causing her to miss his covers by a few hairs. Oh, come on, she whined. Zorian, don't be such a jerk. Put me down. Zorian gave her an evil smile and started to float her sideways, away from the bed. Slowly. Kiriel quickly clarified, catching on to what he intended to do. Put me down slowly. He thought about letting her fall and then telekinetically catching her in the last moment before she hit the floor, but quickly discarded the idea. He wasn't that confident in his unstructured levitation skills or his timing, for that matter. He gently floated Kiriel down to the floor and got out of bed. Unfortunately, Kiriel was rather fascinated by her brief experience with magical levitation, and was instantly upon him, bombarding him with an endless stream of questions. Well, that kind of backfired on him. He just couldn't get her to calm down. How long can you keep doing that? Kiriel asked. I don't know, Zorian said. And he really didn't, but he was hoping that if he answered some of her more inconsequential questions, she would eventually give the matter a rest. As such, he tried to give her a more detailed answer. It would depend heavily on how docile you were being and whether I had something else disrupting my concentration. At least an hour, assuming I had your cooperation. Great. Kiriel said happily. In that case, I have an idea. Zorian slowly descended down the stairs, trying not to make too much noise. The idea, after all, was to surprise Mother, and he couldn't exactly do that if. Zorian, get down here already, his mother shouted, the sound of her footsteps making it clear she was rapidly approaching the bottom of the stairs. Your breakfast is getting cold. She entered the main hallway where the stairway was located and then stopped to stare at the spectacle. Zorian himself was fairly unremarkable, but Kiriel was floating in the air beside him instead of using the stairs. There was a brief moment of silence as the two sides stared at each other, one in surprise and the other in expectation of an eventual reaction. In the end, though, it was Kiriel who eventually broke the standoff. The little imp just didn't have the patience to stick to the plan. Mom, I'm flying. Kiriel announced loudly, waving her hands up and down in mimicry of flapping wings. Mother opened her mouth for a second to say something but then thought better of it. She silently rolled her eyes and turned her back on them, mumbling something uncharitable about mages and children. "When you're done playing around, come and eat," she told Zorian, before disappearing into the kitchen again. Zorian and Kiriel shared a glance. Conveniently enough, with Kiriel floating beside him as she was, they were actually at the same eye level. It was totally worth it, Kiriel opined. Yeah, it was. Thus it so happened that Sumrak's quest for restoring his lost memories took him to Corsa, where he descended into the tunnels beneath the city in search of the mythical scorpion swordsman, and the even more mythical orb of memory which they guarded. Zorian spoke dramatically. Little did he know, however, that the scorpion swordsmen were not nearly as honorable as the myths had made them out to be, and that his journey into the depths beneath Corsa would be his most dangerous adventure yet. Zorian swept his hand through the air with a flourish, and the illusion that was there promptly dissolved into ectoplasmic smoke, only to reform into a completely different illusionary scene. Kiriel sat on the edge of her seat, listening in rapt attention. Over the various restarts, Zorian had more or less worked out what sort of things Kiriel found impressive and interesting, so it wasn't very difficult to keep her attention these days. Which was good, because it made the long train ride at the start of the restart a lot more bearable, for both of them, than it would have otherwise been. Only half of his attention was on the story he was telling, though he was also considering what to do in this new restart. More specifically, he was considering whether to have another relatively quiet restart like the previous one had been, or if he should notify the Triumvirate Church about Sudamir's soul trap. The first option seemed more sensible. He had only 2 more restarts, including this one, to raise his skill at interpreting Iranian memories to levels necessary to open the Matriarch's memory packet, and he couldn't afford to get distracted too much. Aside from that, the second option was very attention-grabbing and had the potential of leading Red Robe straight towards him if he did it even slightly wrong. The choice seemed obvious, but Zorian was getting concerned. Red Robe was being too quiet. Sure, the third time traveler may be laboring under the delusion that there's a whole army of other time travelers out to get him, but Zorian would have still expected Red Robe to make some kind of move by now, even if strictly through proxies. That Zorian could detect no trace of Red Robe's actions was slowly making him more and more paranoid. It didn't help his peace of mind that both Taven and Kale were even more certain than Zorian that Red Robe was planning something big rather than simply laying low. Stirring the hornet's nest a little by exposing Sudamir to the authorities just might create enough waves to reveal what Red Robe was planning. In addition to that, pointing the authorities towards Sudamir was bound to do wonders for his investigation into the invasion and their leadership. There was no way that an investigation into Sudamir would not point them towards the cult of the World Dragon and the Abasins. That was almost certainly going to save Zorian months of work, if only because he could watch carefully who they'd arrest and then investigate those people on his own in future restarts. And if he could actually gain access to written records and the investigators' memories? Absolutely priceless. His main problem with trying to map out the organization of the invasion was that he was just one person and had to conduct his investigation under utmost secrecy. An official investigation would not labor under similar limitations. In fact, Zorian suspected that no matter how skilled and experienced he became over the restarts, he would never really be able to match the investigative power of the entirety of Eldamar and its counterintelligence agencies. People who worked there had dedicated their whole lives to this sort of thing, and he knew for a fact that Eldamar had mined mages of their own under their employ. They could discover things that Zorian wouldn't even think of looking for, because he didn't possess the necessary background to know which questions to ask. The more he thought about it, the more he liked the idea. He would have to be very, very careful, but this could be just what he needed to connect everything together. Yes, he was definitely approaching the church when they arrived in Scioria. "Hey, don't space out now," Kiriel protested. "You haven't finished the story. We just got to the good part." Sorry. Zorian apologized hurriedly. He found it kind of amusing that what Kiriel considered good parts usually involved fighting of some sort. Well, that or usage of some kind of epic magic. As I was saying, the Scorpion swordsman had just led Sumrak to the supposed secret area where the Orb of Memory rested on a pedestal, beneath the holy stalactite, when suddenly his guides turned on him. Though Zorian had resolved to approach the Triumvirate Church about Sudamir, his first action upon settling a little in Scioria was not to go to the nearest temple, it was to track down Svim and tell him about the time loop. He saw no point in wasting time by waiting until Friday to confront him, as the sooner Zorian told him about the time loop, the sooner Svim would accept it as true and start working with him again. In fact, Zorian had hoped that Svim would be even easier to convince this time, since he was in possession of the password thingy that Svim had given him in the previous restart. Unfortunately, easier didn't mean effortless. Despite the password, that Zorian was certain he had memorized correctly, Svim was highly suspicious of him. It took several hours worth of questions before he was willing to accept Zorian's story even provisionally, and he didn't seem terribly convinced even then. He told Zorian they would talk more on Friday and then basically kicked him out of his house. Maybe he should have waited until Monday and spoken to Svim in his office instead of visiting him at his home. No matter. Depending on how things went with the church, he might actually need a free week to set things up properly. The next day, he went to a temple. Specifically, he went to a temple he had already visited in the previous restarts, the one with the nice green-haired priest and the future divining high priestess. There was no particular reason to pick that temple over the others other than familiarity, but he didn't think it would matter. Whatever temple he went to, they would still report to the same parent organization. Batak was as polite and welcoming as always. He immediately greeted Zorian upon his arrival at the temple and ushered him inside. After serving them both some tea and engaging in some small talk, he probed Zorian for his reason of coming. "It's unusual to see a young man like you visit our temple," Batak remarked. "Do you do this often?" "Well, no," Zorian admitted. "To be honest, I tend to avoid temples. I've had some bad experiences with them in the past. But I wanted to report something and ask for some advice, so here I am." "Oh. What kind of bad experiences?" Batak asked curiously. Of course he wanted to know about that. Zorian would have thought that something to report would have aroused Batak's curiosity more, but apparently not. "It's a bit of a long story," Zorian sighed. "The first thing you have to keep in mind is that I am an empath." "As in, you can sense other people's emotions?" asked Batak. "A useful gift." "When trained," Zorian nodded. "But as a child, I had no control over it. I didn't even know I'm an empath. All I knew was that being around large groups of people made me sick and dizzy. And back in my hometown of Siren, the temple was usually packed full of people. The few times my parents brought me there, I ended up fainting and causing a bit of a stir." "That's unfortunate," Batak said sympathetically. "Not as unfortunate as the old priest's reaction was," Zorian said, shaking his head. "He really took my reaction personally. He decided that I have some kind of bad blood that was repelled by the holiness of the temple." "Bad blood?" Batak asked incredulously. "My mother was of which lineage?" Zorian clarified. "Ah," Batak said in understanding. "That makes more sense. While I don't condone the man's reaction, it was not entirely unreasonable to believe you have some witch-descended bloodline issue going on with you. Lineages were very important to witches, and they loved inheritable magic abilities. Many of their influential families had some kind of bloodline power to draw on." "Wait," Zorian frowned. "Then my empathy." "It is entirely possible," Batak nodded. "Damn. So it was possible that the bigoted old priest could have actually been right about him, at least in a way. Because if his empathy really was something he had inherited through his witch lineage, then bad blood really did have a hand in his fainting episodes. He didn't know whether to be amused or bitter about that. "I thought empathy was fairly generic, as far as special powers go," Zorian said. Lots of people have it, relatively speaking. Special powers don't pop out of nowhere, Batak said. Most are a product of potions, rituals, spiritual possession and the like. But sometimes these powers can get transferred to a person's descendants while staying dormant for a generation or two before resurfacing. It's a bit of a public secret, but when a child is born with a magic power out of nowhere, that almost always means the child has some interesting things hidden in their family tree. In regards to empathy being relatively common, well, I'm guessing that there are more people with, shall we say, interesting backgrounds than most people would be willing to admit. That was very interesting, because witches were endemic to Altazia, but empaths could be found all over the 3 continents inhabited by humans. Zorian didn't think all those empaths in Mycena and San drew their roots from some witch born in Altazia. Assuming that Batak was indeed right and random empaths originated from an ancestor that deliberately made themselves psychic, that would mean that lots of people managed to turn themselves psychic over the course of history. In other words, there was some kind of reliable method of turning normal people into psychics circulating around. It couldn't be too easy, since empaths were still rather rare, but clearly it wasn't impossibly hard either. There was also the matter of his family. If his psychic nature was indeed some kind of pseudo-bloodline thing, then his mother and siblings were bound to have it as well, if only in a dormant fashion. He knew that most of them were not full-blown psychics, since he would have felt it if they were, but maybe Daimen was. His oldest brother did have an uncanny ability to understand people. Well, there was no way to confirm it one way or the other. Daimen was in Koth, and Zorian didn't think he could reach him even if he dedicated an entire restart just to get there. Unless he found a way to instantly reach another continent or something, they would never meet while the time loop lasted. In any case, even if the rest of his family weren't fully psychic, there may yet be a way to awaken their dormant mind magic talent. It was surely easier to unlock a dormant magic ability than to create it out of nowhere, so he couldn't help but wonder if it was possible to, say, make Kyriel psychic in a relatively easy and painless fashion. Not that he would do that, as the idea of a psychic Kyriel absolutely terrified him, but maybe once she was older and able to handle the power responsibly. Anyway, Batak continued after a short pause, I believe you said something about wanting to make a report and needing advice. Yes, Zorian said. He then withdrew a blank, sealed envelope from his pocket and handed it to Batak, who frowned at him. An anonymous report? Batak mumbled to himself. Personally, Zorian didn't feel this was very anonymous. Anonymous would have meant sending the letter through normal mail, without ever having to meet face to face with anyone. Unfortunately, as much as Zorian liked that idea, that would have gotten him nowhere. Such a report would not be taken seriously at all, and would likely be thrown into the trash before it ever reached someone important. If he wanted the church to actually do something, he had to talk to an actual priest and have them vouch from him that his report had been made in good faith. I have to ask, is this absolutely necessary? Batak said, concerned. The information contained in the letter concerns the crimes of a highly influential person with plenty of subordinates, Zorian said blandly. If my name is known, I would fear for my safety. I see, Batak sighed. Very well, I will forward your report to my superiors as it is. I must warn you, however, that they are not terribly fond of anonymous reports. They are seen as unreliable. Rest assured that your concerns will be looked into, but it may take some time before the church investigators get around to it. How long is some time? Zorian frowned. A few weeks. Possibly months, if something more urgent comes up, Batak said. Damn. So much for that idea. It seemed he would have to go with his plan B, talking to Alanik Zosk. He had wanted to avoid doing that, since he kind of doubted that the old warrior priest would just leave him be without any questions afterwards, but it seemed he had no choice. If he absolutely had to make a face-to-face report to someone, Alanik was probably his best shot. The man was almost certain to believe him and probably cared enough about Zorian to keep his identity secret. He could always just end the restart prematurely if things got too out of hand. Well, with that out of the way, what can I advise you about? Batak asked, pushing the letter to the side of the table. Souls and necromancy, Zorian told him bluntly. Oh, Batak said, suddenly sitting a little straighter. That is quite an unusual topic to ask about. Young man, the only advice about necromancy I can give you is, don't use it. I wasn't planning to, Zorian shook his head. What I want to know is why somebody else might do so. And also why they would feel the need to gather thousands of souls and keep them imprisoned in a giant crystal pillar. Batak gave him a blank look, glanced to the side of the table where Zorian's sealed letter was innocently resting, then gave Zorian another blank look. Then he placed the letter in front of him again and wrote urgent on top of the envelope in big, blocky letters before setting it aside again. Well. Zorian still intended to go talk to Alanik, since he had no idea how much influence Batak's little remark would have on his superiors, but he was still touched by the gesture. You probably know this, but souls are very mysterious things, Batak said seriously. They have many functions, most of which we can't even understand, much less influence. But their most important function is not, as many mages believe, that they allow one to produce and shape mana. It is the fact they serve as a living, breathing record of everything a particular entity is. Zorian raised his eyebrows in incomprehension. The gods originally gave souls to living beings in order to record their thoughts and forms, so that their lives may be preserved after death and their deeds properly judged in the afterlife, Batak said. For that reason, the gods, who had intimate knowledge of how souls worked, were capable of many miraculous things. So long as they had access to a person's soul, they could bring them back to life, even if their bodies had been reduced to ash and scattered into the winds. They could peer into their soul to examine their entire life from the moment they were born. They could restore a person's youth by regressing their forms to the state they once possessed. According to some stories, they could even create an identical copy of a person, indistinguishable from the original in every way. Copies of people. Zorian frowned. It is not that strange, Batak said, waving his hand dismissively. The simulacrum spell does something very similar. While simulacrums are in no way flawless, they are sufficiently real that some people have argued the use of the spell is inherently unethical. They believe that every time a simulacrum disperses, a person dies. Do you? Zorian asked. No, Batak shook his head. Naturally, I follow my church's dogma, and it states that only things with souls are considered people. Simulacrums do not have them. But this is a digression, and I am not an expert on such magic. What is important is that soul magic has the potential of giving earthly mages godlike powers over their fellow man. It is little wonder, then, that many people have coveted such power over the years. Their efforts have been mostly in vain, but that doesn't stop necromancers from committing atrocity after atrocity in an effort to unlock mysteries of the soul. Zorian considered this information for a few moments. The idea of souls as divine recording devices was totally plausible to him, since he could clearly see that simply sending his soul back in time could keep his memories intact. Which was rather curious, now that he thought about it. It was common knowledge that human minds were stored inside the brain. Was his soul overriding his brain cells upon the start of every restart, or was something yet more exotic going on there? Though there was something about that story about gods making copies of people that was nagging him in the back of his head. He felt like he was missing something important. So why is soul damage so catastrophic to the body? Zorian asked curiously. Clearly the connection between the body and soul is not just one way. Clearly, Batak agreed. But nobody really understands the nature of that connection and the way it works. It is known that souls cannot think or feel when not embodied in something. The soul needs a body, even if it's just an ectoplasmic shell, but the body equally needs a soul. It's likely that such a catastrophic reaction to soul damage has a lot to do with a person's life force, however. Zorian racked his brains for a moment, trying to remember what life force had to do with anything. If he remembered correctly, life force was simply a special type of personal mana that wasn't part of a mage's mana pool and was used exclusively by the body to keep itself living and resist foreign magics. Since the amount of life force rarely varied much between humans, and couldn't be used to power spells, the academy instructors hadn't spoken much about it. Wait. That was it, wasn't it? Life force was something every living being had and depended on to stay alive. And it was basically just an exotic form of mana. And the outer portion of the soul, the part that can get warped and mutilated, was the one in charge of regulating a person's mana flow. If a person's soul was damaged, that would cause their very life-giving energies to spin out of control. I understand now, Zorian nodded. Though, if I could trouble you for a few more questions. 2 hours later, Zorian wrapped up his conversation with Batak and left the temple. Strangely, the green-haired priest actually expressed a wish for Zorian to drop by sometime for another chat. Strange. Zorian would have expected the man to be rather leery of him after discussing such a topic. He gave Batak a non-committal response, unsure whether he should take the man's offer, and left for home. The next day, Zorian went to Nyazov Dveri to talk to Alanik. Since he had saved Lukav from Sudamir's schemes and helped Alanik drive off his own attackers, he figured that the man would be well disposed towards him and inclined to listen to what he had to say. Just to be sure, however, Zorian had made a little detour before talking to the warrior priest. He went to the house of Vazin, the merchant that did Sudamir's dirty work, and stole all the incriminating evidence from his safe. In the end, though, Alanik didn't even look at all those papers Zorian had brought him. The moment Zorian started talking to him about a mansion full of undead and the soul trap surrounding it, he demanded that Zorian teleport him to the place immediately. Not tomorrow or in an hour or when he was done looking through all the gathered evidence immediately. So Zorian did just that, internally grumbling about all the effort he had wasted into preparing his case. Wasn't Alanik in the least bit afraid that Zorian would teleport him into some sort of prearranged trap? No, apparently he wasn't. Once Zorian teleported them to the edge of Ayaska Mansion's ward, Alanik just stood still and stared in the direction of Ayaska Mansion in total silence. This continued for quite a long time. Are you okay? Zorian finally said, unable to restrain himself any longer. Shouldn't you be casting spells to confirm my story? There is no need, Alanik said calmly. I can feel the spiritual sinkhole tugging at my soul easily enough. Zorian looked at Alanik in alarm. We're in no danger, Alanik assured him. The effect is weak and the souls of living beings are tethered to their bodies too strongly to succumb to it. It's only because my awareness of my own soul is so high that I can easily spot it. You have some measure of soul awareness too, I see, but too little to notice such things. So a sufficiently good soul mage could tell that the soul trap existed just by entering its area of effect? No wonder Sudamir considered everyone with a hint of aptitude in the field a threat to his plans. Even if most of the people he killed and kidnapped weren't on the level of skill that Alanik displayed, it only took one to blow his conspiracy wide open. Suddenly, Zorian noticed a group of dark dots flying towards him and swore internally. Damn iron beaks. I hate to interrupt you, but some of the mansion's guards are already coming towards us, Zorian told Alanik. If we don't leave, we'll soon be flooded with winter wolves, undead boars, and the like. I speak from experience. Oh, so you've done some sneaking around the place already? Alanik asked curiously. Had you read all the information I brought you, you would have known that, Zorian grumbled. Worry not, we'll get back to the information later, when we start organizing an assault on this place with the army. Zorian gave Alanik a surprised look, startled. What? Alanik laughed. Did you think we were going to infiltrate this place? No, we're bringing soldiers, artillery and several mage combat groups and sieging the place into submission. And you're going to help me investigate the rubble. What? I don't get any say in this. Zorian asked, unable to keep a bit of challenge from creeping into his voice. Damn it, This was exactly what he was afraid of. Don't complain, Alanik told him. I know what you're going to say, you don't want to be involved. You want to go home and pretend this has nothing to do with you, right? Well, yeah, Zorian admitted. I gave you all the information I know, what more do you want from me? I truly doubt you've really told me everything you know. And the army will be doubtful as well, Alanik sighed. They will want to find you, and they would eventually succeed at doing so. If, on the other hand, you are clearly working for me, they will be leery of going after you. Strange as it may sound to you, you are far safer beside me than you are on your own. As if to punctuate his claim, Alanik pointed his hand at the approaching iron-beak flock and snapped his fingers. A dazzling beam of electricity erupted from his palm and struck the leading bird. In the blink of an eye, the beam arced from one bird to another, jumping from target to target. In but a moment, a 20-strong flock had been reduced to a rain of charred corpses and blown-off feathers that descended on the forest canopy. Okay, he had to admit, that was very impressive. Especially since he knew that Alanik was a fire specialist. It would seem his specialization wasn't as narrow as Zorian had thought. Still. How would the army even know I exist unless you tell them about it? Zorian argued. I'll have to tell them about it, Alanik said, shaking his head. I'm not much of a liar, and they can be rather shrewd and persistent. It wouldn't take them long to figure out that I'm working with someone else, and they will naturally want to know who that person is. Ugh. How annoying. Should he just dismiss this restart as a failure and start over? No, not yet. Maybe he could get this to work. I need to stay anonymous, Zorian eventually said. We will work something out, Alanik said dismissively. And that was that. From that moment onward, Alanik considered him his subordinate. Zorian had to admit, it was kind of amazing how quickly Eldamar could mobilize its forces once it identified a serious threat. It took only 4 days for them to organize the assault on Ayaska Mansion and mobilize the necessary troops. The Triumvirate Church was involved too, sending 2 groups of 12 warrior priests each to support the several hundred soldiers and nearly 50 mages that Eldamar itself threw at the problem. 4 huge war golems and 13 magic-enhanced cannons served as heavy support. Zorian himself was not involved much in the preparations. He mostly just silently followed Alanik around, clad in a face-concealing robe that the warrior priest had given him. The few times he had to speak, he did so exclusively through a magic orb that could translate his thoughts to speech. He had made it himself, surprising Alanik somewhat. Apparently Zorian's standards were a little skewed again, and what he thought was a mildly useful trinket was actually something that was worth quite a bit of money in stores and took some practice to learn how to use. From what Alanik had told him, the rest of the force thought he was some kind of elite investigator in the employ of the Triumvirate Church and were more than a little intimidated by him. Alanik seemed endlessly amused by that. In any case, very few questions had been asked about his presence, but the restart was still young and Zorian didn't dare hope that could last. At least for now, though, his identity was secure. He really felt out of his depth in all of this, though. This wasn't what he'd had in mind at all when he had decided to make the church aware of Sudamir's schemes. Hell, Sudamir himself was probably long gone now. There was no way he hadn't noticed all the preparations going on around him. He told Alanik as much one day, but the warrior priest didn't share his opinion. Sudamir has invested a lot of time and money into that place, he said. There's no way he's going to abandon it without a fight. 4 days is not enough for him to evacuate his possessions from that place, and he probably had less than that. I doubt he noticed the preparations straight away. If you had moved more carefully in the start, you could have probably arrested him before he realized what was happening, Zorian said. Not at all. You can't just suddenly arrest a popular and influential mayor like Sudamir like that, Alanik said. You need solid evidence or else people will cry foul. What you gathered is a good start, but nowhere near enough. Attacking a mansion full of undead is a lot easier to justify, and I'm sure we will find plenty of evidence to convict him inside. Zorian shook his head, not really convinced, but he didn't argue the point further. He would just have to wait for the assault to see how things went. Alanik and the army might be right, after all. Considering the amount of forces the army planned to bring to bear on Ayaska Mansion, there was no way to really launch a surprise attack on the place. Even with the use of teleportation, it would take quite a while to bring everyone over to their destination and assume proper positions. As such, the initial phase of the plan called for 3 groups of mages to arrive first and erect a large-scale teleport ward over the entire region, hopefully preventing Sudamir from simply teleporting out when he realized the sheer scale of the assault heading his way. Well, that part of the plan went off without a hitch. Unfortunately, erecting the anti-teleportation had been like kicking over the hornet's nest. Almost as soon as the ward solidified, endless streams of undead started pouring out of the mansion, as well as from the storage facility next to it. Skeletons, undead boars, flesh golems, massive abominations of stitched human flesh. Zorian didn't even know Sudamir had those. Then again, they were just upscaled versions of a normal flesh golem. The amount of reanimated soldiers Sudamir had at his disposal was mind-boggling. Zorian could only presume that he hadn't faced such hordes in his own incursions on Ayaska Mansion, because by that point most of these joined the invaders in their attack on Scioria. Caught off guard by the ferocious counterattack, the army struggled to organize its forces. Fortunately, these were all disciplined and experienced soldiers, and they came here fully expecting to fight against undead hordes. It would take a lot more than this to demoralize them. Cannons fired again and again into the approaching horde, thinning the ranks considerably. The 4 solid steel war golems, although far inferior in numbers to the giant flesh-stitched monstrosities mixed into the undead ranks, proved to be far superior to them in strength and durability. The giant flesh golems failed to make a breakthrough, being thrown back again and again until they fell apart. Nonetheless, the chaos of that initial exchange meant that a lot of mages and ordinary soldiers fell to the horde. 10 mages and more than 50 normal soldiers became casualties in the first 10 minutes of the battle. After that, however, the army had had enough time to get a grip on the situation. As had the mages. After some initial difficulty, they finished some kind of multi-mage spell, and a pair of giant fire vortexes suddenly sprang into existence in front of the approaching horde. Almost like living beings, the 2 vortexes wove through the undead ranks, sucking up reanimated bodies into their center, where they were burnt to a crisp. The strange thing was that instead of growing weaker with time, the vortexes only seemed to be getting stronger with every undead body they consumed. The few reanimated corpses and flesh golems that survived the artillery, war golems, and fire vortexes were met with a hail of grenades and high-caliber bullets wielded by normal soldiers, and none of them survived to make contact with the assault force. And then the top of Ayaska Mansion exploded upwards. For a moment Zorian thought that Sudamir had perhaps once again panicked in the face of a determined attack and did something to screw himself over, just like he had during their last encounter, but then something inside the resulting dust cloud roared. Something huge. The roar reverberated through the area, creating a shockwave of force that blew away all dust and debris, shielding the top of Ayaska Mansion from sight. As such, Zorian was treated to a sight of a massive metal platform that was almost entirely taken up by an equally massive skeletal dragon. Its gleaming white bones glowed with countless lines of yellow light that signified a staggering amount of spell formula etched onto the long-dead bones, and instead of being hollow, its ribcage seemed to be crammed full of some kind of metal machinery and likewise looked rather sophisticated in nature. What? Why did Sudamir have that thing? Why hadn't he ever given any indication he had something like that in the past? The skeletal dragon didn't care about Zorian's internal incredulity and muttered curses. Its entire surface lit up with a pale yellow light, creating some sort of ghostly mimicry of a membrane over its wing bones, and then it lazily took flight. It set off straight towards where Zorian and Alanik were standing. The battle for Ayaska Mansion had begun. Zorian was caught thoroughly off guard by the appearance of the skeletal dragon. After all, he had already explored Ayaska Mansion during the previous restarts, and thus thought he knew what kind of forces Sudamir had at his disposal. He could hardly believe he'd managed to miss something so big and dramatic. On top of that, the way in which the skeletal dragon revealed itself was very loud and dramatic, and it clearly knew where to find Zorian, since it immediately set off towards him. Well, probably not towards him specifically in all likelihood, it just went after the assault force leadership, trying to perform a decapitation strike. Not a bad idea, since most of said leadership was concentrated in one command area. Granted, such an attack needed a proper strike force, one that could somehow bypass the front lines to reach the command area in the back, and one that was strong enough to overcome the defenses protecting it, but the skeletal dragon coming after them probably qualified. It could fly pretty fast, after all, and it was clearly infused with very potent magic. Unfortunately, the leadership of the strike force included Alanik, from whom Zorian never strayed much due to the role he'd assumed in front of the rest of the assault force. So now he had a huge dragon skeleton coming straight at him. Safest place in the entire battlefield, my ass, Zorian mumbled gloomily, just loud enough for Alanik to hear him. The stern priest said nothing, instead focusing on casting a spell of some sort. An anti-scrying measure, if Zorian interpreted his chants and gestures correctly. Zorian supposed that Alanik was disturbed at the ease with which Sudamir had managed to pinpoint their command area, and was trying to prevent further surveillance. Glancing around him, Zorian noticed that the other mages in the command area were also hurriedly casting spells. The command area became a hurricane of activity in a flash, well, even more so than it already had been during the opening clashes of the assault. Despite this, Zorian remained still, aware that any contribution of his would likely cause more harm than good. He could barely understand what was going on around him, so how could he make sure he wasn't getting in the way? Unless one of the mages asked for his assistance, he would refrain from doing anything. The dragon had barely started its flight towards the command area when a thick black cloud rose into the sky from the forest around the mansion. Iron beaks. Their numbers blackened the sky and filled the air with ominous cawing that could easily be heard all the way to where Zorian was standing. Sudamir probably intended them to serve as a distraction for the skeleton dragon. The swarm of magical corvids quickly separated itself into 5 smaller flocks and descended upon the assault force, sending a rain of knife-like feathers at the Eldamarian soldiers. In response, one Eldamarian war golem pointed its metal palms at the approaching iron beaks, and a series of explosions erupted in the midst of the flock, killing hundreds of birds with each detonation. The regular soldiers were not defenseless either, and soon brought out some kind of grenade launcher devices and started firing potion canisters into the air. They detonated into flashes of light and electricity, effortlessly scything through the attacking birds. Despite this, the iron beaks kept coming, their numbers seemingly endless. If anything, the death of so many of their kin only made them fiercer and angrier, if the increased volume of cawing and feather attacks was any indication. Zorian frowned and shifted in his place uneasily. He had been uneasy with the trajectory of the whole restart for a while now, feeling he had completely lost control over events a while ago. Seeing the scene in front of him, that unease only grew stronger. The Eldamarian forces might even lose at this rate. Should he end the current restart and start over? No, not yet. He was taking a bit of a risk, since dying here meant getting sucked into that soul-gathering pillar that Sudamir had in his mansion, but he wanted to see how things would develop. At the very least, he wanted to see how the battle would end. Maybe Sudamir had more surprises in store for them, not just the undead dragon currently flying towards him. And speaking of the skeletal dragon, Zorian had expected it to swoop in and try to tear them apart in melee combat. Most skeletons could not manage much beside that. Evidently, though, the spell formula and machinery used in this skeletal dragon's construction were not there just for show. Still on its way towards them, the dragon skeleton opened its maw and fired a thin yellow spell beam at them from within the depths of its skull. The beam was faint and translucent, but Zorian knew better than to assume this made it weak. It crossed the distance between the dragon and the command area in an instant, losing little of its coherence in the process. Thankfully, the mages in charge of the defense had good reflexes. In the brief moment between when the skeletal dragon opened its maw and the beam flew out, they managed to erect a barrier to tank the blow. Unlike the barriers that Zorian was familiar with, this one wasn't a thin layer of force, it was a thick, gelatinous wall of ectoplasm that distorted everything seen through it. The undead dragon's beam impacted the wall and blew a huge crater in its surface, easily digging through more than half of its thickness. However, the nearby material in the rest of the wall quickly flowed into the hole, filling it up in a matter of seconds. Soon, the whole thing looked as if it had never been damaged in the first place. The dragon fired the beam 2 more times, trying to overwhelm the defense by targeting the same spot on the wall through continuous fire. It failed. It simply could not deal enough damage to counteract the wall's regenerative abilities. Undaunted by the failure, the skeletal dragon continued flying towards the command area. The 2 fire vortexes that were created to deal with the initial undead horde, still going strong, moved to intercept the creature. The dragon actually swerved from its trajectory to confront one of the vortexes, breathing some kind of massive dispelling wave at it. Although the flame of the vortex grew noticeably dimmer in the wave's passage, it resisted dispersal. At the same time, volley after volley of spell projectiles started homing in towards the undead dragon as it entered the range of defending mages. The spells hurled at it were very diverse, just about every one of them was different from the rest in some fashion. After a while Zorian realized that they were testing the dragon's wards to see if there were any obvious weaknesses in its defenses. Unfortunately, the attack spells hurled at the skeletal dragon were about as successful as the dragon's long-range attack on the command area was, which was to say, they weren't. Part of the problem was that the skeleton dragon was surprisingly agile, swooping through the air with incredible grace, and a part of it was that it had its own force field to protect itself. It was just a simple force aegis, nothing fancy, but there was a reason why the aegis series of spells was so popular among mages. They worked pretty well. A layer of force like that could stop anything that a physical obstacle could, and most spells couldn't go through solid objects. Still, the spell volleys continued to come, and the 2 fire vortexes did their damnedest to engulf the dragon and drag it into their fiery depths. Though the vortexes looked like energy constructs, they could evidently exert plenty of physical force, because they managed to completely halt the dragon's advance. Their attempts to do actual damage nonetheless proved completely ineffectual. The skeletal dragon seemed to possess inexhaustible quantities of mana for the purposes of powering its defenses, and everything that connected with it was shrugged off. It was probably powered by captured souls, much like the mansion it was defending. But the skeletal dragon's advance had been halted, and no defense was truly perfect. One of the mages found a spell that was remarkably good at burning through the thing's shield, some kind of disc made out of purple fire that glued itself to the surface of the shield and kept draining it, and eventually the first layer of the skeleton dragon's defenses fell. Unfortunately, the undead dragon seemed to have realized it had found itself in an unenviable position and promptly intensified its struggles. It fired one attack after another at the fire vortexes, occasionally sending an attack or 2 at the other threats targeting it, causing both vortexes to disperse. And then it fired its yellow beams again, but this time it didn't aim them directly at the command area or the rest of the Eldamarian forces. Instead, it fired the beam at the ground in front of its targets, dragging the beams across the landscape. Huge amounts of dust and gravel were thrown into the air, reducing visibility and disrupting many of the spell volleys coming after it. Many of the spell projectiles fared poorly when aimed through dust clouds, detonating prematurely or veering off course. By now, Zorian was completely certain that he was not dealing with a mindless automaton like most of the undead were. The decisions made by the skeletal dragon clearly indicated there was a sapient mind driving its actions. Either the construct itself was not as mindless as your average skeleton, or Sudamir was personally piloting it through some remote link, much like Zorian had been piloting his golems the last time he'd invaded Ayaska Mansion. If the dragon was not a mindless undead, then that meant it was potentially vulnerable to mind magic. He tried to extend his mind sense far enough to check up on the idea, but the dragon was still too far away for that. Can you lure it closer? Zorian asked Alanik. I know it's dangerous, but I might be able to disable it if I can get close to it. We're already working on it, one of the mages close to them said suddenly, cutting into the conversation before Alanik could say anything. We have a surprise of our own prepared for it once it gets close enough, but we can't be too blatant about luring it here or it will realize something is wrong and keep its distance. What do you have in mind? I want to try attacking its mind, Zorian admitted. Oh. A mind mage, huh? The man asked him rhetorically, giving him a speculative look. Could work, I guess. Tell me when you think the moment is right and we'll try to give you an opening. Zorian didn't really understand what kind of opening they thought they could give him when it came to mind magic assault, but he nodded in assent anyway. While most of the mages had been trying to deal with the undead dragon, the rest of Eldamar's forces had been busy dealing with the iron beaks assailing them. At some point, isolated packs of winter wolves and war trolls had joined the iron beaks in their counterattack, but somehow Eldamar's forces were still holding. After a few minutes, Zorian noticed that some of the mages were teleporting away and returning with extra forces and realized how apparently Eldamar had been prepared for the possibility of the assault going wrong and prepared reinforcements to be brought in as needed. A small but steady stream of new mages and mundane soldiers constantly kept trickling into the area to strengthen the existing forces. It's coming, the mage that had previously spoken with Zorian shouted. And indeed, the undead dragon had clearly decided it was done playing around and made a beeline straight at the command area once more. The man turned to Zorian. We'll hit it with a dozen paralysis bolts the moment it comes close enough. It probably won't do anything, but it should tie up some of its mental defenses. The moment I give you the signal, do your thing. You have one attempt, and then we'll go with our plan. Zorian concentrated at the approaching enemy, extending his mind sense as far as he could in the skeletal dragon's direction. The dragon fired beam after beam at the barrier protecting the command area, and the damage done to the wall was noticeably growing more severe as it got closer. At point-blank range, it could probably cut through the wall of ectoplasm and deal actual damage to the command area provided it still had enough power to punch through the rest of the defensive wards that had been erected around the area when the place had been made. Still, even if the wards could hold out against the beams for a time, they surely would not last long. It was best to stop the thing as quickly as possible. The skeleton dragon accelerated as it got closer, clearly intending to ram the wall with its entire mass, trusting its durability. The moment it had entered Zorian's psychic range, however, he knew he had it. He could sense the mind behind the dragon clear as day. It was shielded, but Zorian could immediately tell it was not enough to stop him from breaking through. He didn't have much time, though. The dragon was traveling pretty damn fast and 12 bright blue bolts suddenly converged at the approaching skeletal dragon, cast by the mages around Zorian. This close, their target could not dodge, even with its amazing aerial acrobatics, and its force aegis had been exhausted long ago. The moment the bolts had struck the undead dragon, their combined force smashed the mental shield protecting its mind like a hammer striking an egg. For a fraction of a second, the dragon's skeletal form even grew rigid, continuing to fly forward due to existing momentum but temporarily paralyzed by the combined effect of those 12 bolts. But although the paralysis itself had been shrugged off almost instantly, that was immaterial. The important thing was that its mental shield had been stripped away from it, leaving it completely unguarded. Zorian immediately launched a barrage of psychic knives straight at the mind that controlled the dragon. The controller recoiled in pain and shock, caught by surprise by the brutal assault, and Zorian took advantage of its weakened influence on the undead dragon to seize control of it for a moment. In an instant, the skeleton dragon changed the direction of its flight downward, plowing straight into the ground with all of its considerable speed. Mountains of dust and gravel erupted into the air as it dug a deep trench into the ground below, slamming into several trees. The trees came out worse in the collision, before gradually coming to a halt some distance from the command area. For a moment, everyone around Zorian halted and turned towards him in silence. Holy hell, somebody said. That actually worked. It's still intact, Zorian said tersely. And the controller is still fighting me for influence. All I can do is keep it still for the moment, and even that isn't going to last long. Indeed, while the undead dragon's controller had been caught off guard by Zorian's move, the fact was that trying to attack a controller through the puppet they were controlling was not an easy thing to do, even for him. It greatly lowered the speed and power of Zorian's mental attacks, and the controller had already restored their mental defenses by now and was doing his damnedest to reassert control over the skeletal dragon. The blasted thing clearly had some kind of powerful control array built into it, because Zorian was quickly losing the battle for control over it. You've done more than enough, Alanik said, before turning to one of the army leaders around him. Fire the living metal rounds. Behind the command area, 4 hidden artillery emplacements opened fire, each one unerringly hitting the immobile skeletal dragon. Instead of exploding, the projectiles erupted into a tangled mess of silvery threads that wrapped themselves around the skeletal dragon, seeking to entangle it firmly. Originally we wanted to use this to force it down to the ground, Alanik told him. But this is even better. Once the living metal roots itself into the ground, that thing will never set flight again. How long do you think Dash? Zorian felt the mind behind the dragon finally wrench control of the body away from him, and the immobile form of the skeletal dragon suddenly began to struggle and thrash against the metal threads. Never mind, Alanik sighed. I guess we'll have to do this the hard way. Though the undead dragon struggled fiercely, the metal threads appeared unbreakable. They writhed and coiled like some kind of metallic worms, constantly seeking purchase on the long-dead bones. Far from freeing itself, the dragon's struggle seemed to only leave it in direr straits, as the threads took advantage of its shifting and thrashing to bind it more firmly. It tried to render the threads inert by breathing a dispelling wave at them, cycled through 4 different magical fields, also doing nothing to the threads, before finally trying to fire its deadly yellow beam at the nearby command area. Unfortunately for it, the threads had restricted its movements too much by that point, and it could no longer point its head in the proper direction. Frustrated, the dragon roared, much like it had when it had first revealed itself. This close, its roar was more than just an intimidation tool. The sound was loud enough to rupture one's eardrums, and the kinetic shockwave created by the roar itself could easily send an unprotected man flying. Fortunately, the command area was warded against such relatively minor damage, and Zorian simply had to endure some painful ringing in his ears in the aftermath. Eldamarian forces started to rain spells and artillery shells at the dragon, apparently unconcerned with the possibility of damaging the living metal threads that were keeping the undead dragon chained to the ground. For good reason, it turned out, as nothing seemed to do any damage to them. Or perhaps any damage dealt to them was immediately healed. The living metal thing they were made of seemed to be a very morphic, malleable material. Sudamir didn't seem to like the predicament his fancy undead superweapon found itself in, because not long after the attack barrage started, several massive magical projectiles were launched into the air from Ayaska Mansion. They ascended high into the sky before descending down to the earth again, traveling across a parabolic trajectory and crossing immense distances in the process far beyond what normal magic was capable of. Zorian was reminded of that very first invasion, that he could actually remember, and the fake fireworks that served as a beginning of the invasion. It was the same thing. He could instantly tell he was dealing with artillery magic. Spells like those took a long time to cast and used incredible amounts of mana to power them, but they had both extreme range and extreme damage potential. Zorian wasn't the only one who had immediately figured it out. Almost immediately, the leadership of the assault force decided to abandon their current position. 2 of the projectiles were aimed at the command area, and nobody was sure whether the existing defenses would hold out against even one. Fortunately, artillery spells like these ones were very slow, making it easy to move away before they hit. Fundamentally, they were intended to be used against static targets, and were ineffective against things that could move out of the way. But Zorian suspected that Sudamir never intended for them to actually die, he just wanted to disrupt their attack on his pet undead dragon. A ploy that was quite successful, as Eldamarian forces scrambled to get out of the way of the descending artillery spells. But Eldamarian mages didn't just passively run away. Even as they shifted their forces to escape from the blast areas, they began to cast artillery spells of their own as retaliation. Soon, several new artillery spells rose in the air, targeting Ayaska Mansion. Sudamir had still struck first, though, so by the time they were halfway to their target, the artillery spells that had been launched from Ayaska Mansion reached their destination. One of them was, amazingly enough, targeting the skeletal dragon. It seemed Sudamir was gambling on the idea that his dragon was tougher than the living metal threads that kept it restrained. The world erupted into fire, light and noise. Almost immediately afterwards, the skeletal dragon flew out of the dust cloud created above its former prison. It was missing one of its legs, and some of its bones were cracked, the spell formula inscribed on them growing dim, but it still moved. Some of the living metal thread still clung to its bones, stubbornly refusing to let go, but there were too few of them now to do anything more than annoy it. It seemed that Sudamir had gambled correctly. The world exploded again as Eldamarian artillery spells reached their destination as well. A shining golden dome of force intercepted the projectiles, shielding Ayaska Mansion from devastation, but it was left dim and flickering in the aftermath. The undead dragon immediately turned back, retreating towards Ayaska Mansion. Its retreat seemed to signify a general retreat, because the surviving winter wolves and war trolls also fled back into the safety of their base. As for the Iron Beaks, their numbers had been cut down to less than half, and the moment they saw the skeletal dragon fleeing from the assault force they scattered in every direction, flying away from Ayaska Mansion at maximum speed. Scanning the minds of several frantic Iron Beaks flying above him, Zorian could tell they had no intention of ever returning to this place. Whatever force Sudamir had used to keep them on his side was apparently insufficient to make them ignore the massive losses they had suffered in this battle. The first battle for Ayaska Mansion was finished, but nobody was fooled into thinking the rest of the siege would be easy. Over the course of the next several hours, Sudamir did his best to stall Eldamar's forces as much as possible. His surviving forces launched constant raids on the assault force, doing little damage at this point but successfully breaking the army's forward momentum. The skeletal dragon, in particular, was still a menace. It no longer made bold, frontal attacks like the one it had performed in the beginning, but it made sure to go after any perceived weakness or recklessness. In addition to that, the area immediately around the mansion was full of hastily erected traps, both magical and mundane, as well as ambush parties composed out of those familiar black-clad, undead corpses that Zorian had met before in Ayaska Mansion. Finally, the defensive wards on the mansion were running at maximum power, burning through whatever mana reserves they had stockpiled to resist the constant artillery bombardment that was being directed at it ever since Sudamir had launched his artillery spells at the assault force. Regardless of how determined Sudamir was to defend his mansion to the end, the outcome had already been decided at the end of that first battle. As hours passed, the noose kept tightening around Sudamir's neck. The forest around the mansion was burned down to cinders to prevent further ambushes and traps. Sudamir's stockpile of undead minions eventually started to run out and the mansion's wards were clearly on the verge of breaking. And then Sudamir did something that Zorian would have never expected him to. He surrendered. Even more amazingly, his surrender was not some kind of trap like Zorian suspected it was when he first heard about it. In the end, Sudamir really did open the gates of his mansion and powered down the defensive wards, letting himself be captured. That just didn't make sense to Zorian. He could have escaped easily enough. The Abasins inside the mansion certainly hadn't stayed. Eldamarian forces found plenty of evidence that a lot of people had been living inside the mansion until very recently, but no one other than Sudamir himself was still present. Even if the Abasins had shut the gate on him, Sudamir could have surely just ridden into the sunset on his fancy skeletal dragon. Zorian waited for a while to give the Eldamarian investigators a chance to explore Ayaska Mansion, and then went to confront Alanik about his concerns. What is there to be confused about? Alanik asked him. If Sudamir had persisted in his resistance, we would have collapsed his stronghold on top of him and he would have died. Nobody wants to die, least of all a necromancer. Yes, shocking stuff, Alanik frowned. It does seem strange that he did not retreat through the gate along with his unknown allies, doesn't it? But you have to remember, just because they cooperated doesn't mean they were actually friendly to one another. It could be that he expects better treatment as an Eldamarian captive than as a long-term guest of his so-called allies. Even so, it shouldn't have been too hard to flee from the battle if he was determined, Zorian insisted. He could have flown out, for instance. Gods know we couldn't have really stopped that pet undead dragon of his if it had simply flown off in a random direction. No, but we could have tracked it, Alanik said. But yes, you are probably right. He could have fled. But that would have meant that we would have leveled this place to the ground. Sudamir seems to be very attached to this place. It seems this is his life's work, and he is loath to see it gone. He cares about his soul trap thing so much. Isn't it destined for destruction anyway? Zorian asked, frowning. Surely Eldamar is not going to let a giant soul trap remain intact. Alanik stared at him for a few seconds before sighing heavily. They're definitely going to release the souls trapped within. Too many people know about them by now, and it would be a huge scandal if it became known they let so many innocent souls remain trapped in that thing. At the very least, I'm sure I can get the Triumvirate Church to apply pressure on Eldamar to do so. Unfortunately, I cannot guarantee that the device itself will be destroyed. Sudamir's work is utterly repugnant, but also very impressive to some people. It's entirely possible he can reach some kind of agreement with Eldamar's government. Agreement? Zorian asked incredulously. How could that possibly work? I know that Eldamar has some secret necromancers under their employ, but Sudamir is. I know, Alanik said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. But it would be completely in line with Eldamar's previous behavior to retool this place into a secret research facility and then place Sudamir under house arrest here. He would be forced to work for Eldamar, and all manner of restrictions would be imposed on him, some of them ethical in nature, but that is obviously a far lighter punishment than a monster like him deserves. I'm almost 100% certain that this is what Sudamir is aiming for. I see, said Zorian unhappily. He knew that Eldamar was no image of perfection and goodness, but he was still unpleasantly surprised that they would be willing to work with someone like Sudamir. Then again, they still didn't know that Sudamir wasn't just practicing illegal magic, but was also actively betraying the country to foreign enemies. Zorian suspected that Eldamar would be a lot less willing to make use of Sudamir once that little fact came out. Of course, Alanik continued, if I were to find out something particularly damning about the man before Eldamar's black divisions have a chance to sequester him to one of their compounds for questioning, then such an agreement might become politically unworkable. There is only so much that can be swept under the rug, after all. Zorian gave Alanik a suspicious look. Meaning what, exactly? Zorian asked. Your ability to target Sudamir's mind through his bone dragon puppet was very impressive, Alanik noted. So it was Sudamir who had been piloting that thing. Zorian had wondered about that. Even if it was for but a moment, you must be a pretty good mind mage to have achieved that. Wait, Alanik was offering him a chance to root through Sudamir's mind for information. Why yes, Zorian was very much interested. Say no more, Zorian told Alanik, trying not to show his enthusiasm. I'll be happy to help you interrogate him. Come with me, then, Alanik said, turning around and motioning for Zorian to follow after him. Mind you, we'll only have an hour or so alone with him. This isn't exactly an official interrogation and there is only so much I can bend the rules. Zorian didn't really care. Frankly, he had a strong feeling he was going to have to terminate this restart prematurely sometime soon anyway, so getting into trouble like that was no big deal. He was just happy this opportunity had fallen so neatly into his lap. He thought he would actually have to try and scheme to get access to Sudamir. He followed after Alanik, mentally preparing a list of questions he wanted Sudamir to answer. How come you didn't just pump him full of truth potions and interrogate him that way? Zorian asked. He knew that Alanik had done that sort of thing in previous restarts, so it was a bit strange to see him hold back in that regard now. That leaves too many traces in the victim's metabolism, Alanik said, shaking his head. I did say I'm bending the rules here, didn't I? I need to be able to play dumb when Sudamir accuses me of using magic to force answers out of him. Right, Zorian nodded. Sorry for being dumb, but I have no experience in things like these, so you'll have to be a little patient with me. An expert mind mage that has no experience in things like these, Alanik stated blandly, visibly rolling his eyes. Right. Zorian decided not to respond to that. There was no way. He could explain how he had really gotten his mind-reading skills, so it was best to stay silent and quietly appreciate the way Alanik was not questioning him about that. For now, anyway. Sudamir looked surprisingly good for someone who had gotten captured by an Eldamarian assault force. He was wearing shaping-disrupting manacles on his wrists and an exploding collar around his neck, but other than that he appeared completely unharmed. He seemed jittery and impatient when they came in, giving Alanik a sour look but not saying anything. Reading his surface thoughts, Zorian found out that Alanik had already been here a couple of times to ask the man questions, and Sudamir was already sick of him. The man refused to discuss anything with Alanik, apparently aware that there was something fishy about him being sent in as an official Eldamarian interrogator. Zorian shrugged and got to work. He didn't try to be subtle, he immediately performed a powerful mental attack on Sudamir, ruthlessly crushing his mental defenses and sending feelers deep into his mind. Sudamir clutched his head in pain, powerless to resist. This close to Zorian, and with his ability to cast spells suppressed by the manacles he was wearing, Sudamir had little hope to expel Zorian from his mind. He couldn't even scream or shout for help, since Zorian had prevented him from doing that. The only difficult thing was making Sudamir speak his answers out loud for Alanik's benefit. He didn't want the warrior priest to know just how effortlessly he could root through someone's memories, but forcing the man to do something was far harder than simply interpreting Sudamir's thoughts and memories, and also, Sudamir was under compulsion not to speak about certain topics. It turned out he had gotten clever and placed a hayas on himself before surrendering, placing restrictions on his ability to discuss some things. Stuff like his cooperation with the Abasins and the planned invasion of Scioria. This was, of course, completely unacceptable. A big part of reporting Ayaska Mansion to Alanik was Zorian's desire to blow the whole conspiracy thing wide open, so the hayas definitely had to go. Zorian was not really a soul mage, so simply removing the hayas was out of the question. Fortunately, he didn't have to do that to neutralize it. Mind magic was a known bane of the hayas type spells. A hayas couldn't prevent a mind mage like Zorian from lifting information straight from someone's mind, and it could not compel one to follow an order they could not remember ever receiving. One of the reasons why hayas were not more popular throughout history was that if the recipient of the hayas was unwilling to play along, they could simply pay a mind mage to purge their memories of the restriction they labored under. The hayas would still technically exist, but the compulsion to honor it would be gone. The hayas Sudamir had placed on himself was very fresh, less than a day old, and thus it took less than 5 minutes for Zorian to make Sudamir forget it ever existed. He didn't even bother notifying Alanik of its existence. In any case, once the full scale of Sudamir's activities started to come to the surface, Alanik decided that he no longer cared about keeping the interrogation short and covert. The interrogation lasted for hours, and only ended because Zorian was afraid he might permanently cripple Sudamir's mind if he kept rummaging through it incessantly. During those several hours, Zorian found out a wealth of information about the Abasin invaders, cult of the world dragon and Sudamir. Most of this information involved the identities of collaborators and places where evidence could be found to doom them. All this was the sort of information that Alanik was most interested in, and Zorian saw no reason not to give it to him. In fact, he intended to visit some of these people himself in some future restarts, but for now he would simply step aside and let Alanik go after them. For Zorian, though, some of the more interesting pieces of information he got from Sudamir concerned the man's reasons for doing what he did. The core of everything seemed to be the fact that his wife died. To be fair, Sudamir was an unscrupulous necromancer even before then, but it was only after his wife contracted the weeping and passed away that he'd really lost it. Rather than accept her death and move on, he extracted her soul and tried to bring her back to life. He failed, naturally. Apparently it was not a simple thing to make a dead soul think again, to say nothing of actually restoring it to a semblance of life. Eventually he bound his wife's soul to Ayaska Mansion, restoring a measure of her mental faculties in the process. That was why the warding scheme of the place could intelligently respond to scans and attempts to bypass it, and also the reason why Sudamir had been utterly unwilling to see it destroyed. He would rather let himself be captured than abandon his wife's soul to eventual destruction. In fact, the biggest reason why Sudamir agreed to help the Abasins was that Quatakikl promised to give him the ritual needed to turn his wife's soul into a lich. A normal lich creation ritual required a living person to work correctly, but Quatakikl claimed he could modify it to work on the disembodied soul of Sudamir's wife too. Whether Quatakikl was lying about that was anyone's guess. The other reason for helping the Abasins invade Scioria, the politics part that Sudamir had mentioned in the past, was that Sudamir wanted to legalize necromancy. After all, his wife was soon to come back to life as a lich, and he certainly didn't plan to die of old age if he could help it either, and it was impossible for him to hide things like that in the long term. Especially if he intended to keep his political position, which he definitely did. Thus, he wanted to make Eldamar drop some of the restrictions surrounding soul magic, or at least to make some special exceptions for him in particular. To that end, he felt he needed to make Eldamar weaker, so they would be desperate for his help, and himself stronger, so he could be the savior they were in desperate need of. The actual details of Sudamir's master plan eluded Zorian, as they were too complex and convoluted for him to figure out in a mere couple of hours. And frankly, Zorian didn't care that much. He found the whole thing crazy to start with, and felt that it was all just an excuse anyway. Sudamir helped the Abasins because he wanted his wife back. Everything else was just him lying to himself. Zorian also encountered a couple of other interesting facts while searching Sudamir's mind, such as the means Sudamir had used to control the Iron Beaks. Apparently it was a mixture of kidnapping their chicks to hold as hostages and dominating some of the more influential members of the flock. Iron Beaks were fiercely protective of their young and intelligent enough to understand a hostage situation, and also didn't seem to realize their leadership structure had been magically subverted, so this ploy worked surprisingly well. Zorian still wasn't sure if it was possible to do anything with this information, but he filed it away for future musings. Eventually, the topic of the interrogation drifted to the issue of primordial summoning, well, more like Zorian guided it there, but whatever, and Zorian decided to see if Sudamir knew the answer to a question that had been bothering Zorian for quite some time. Why does the cult of the world dragon need a shifter child to complete the ritual? Zorian asked. Children. Plural, Sudamir said. He had mostly stopped struggling against Zorian's mental probes by now, since it hurt a lot less that way. Currently he mostly focused on trying to shift the interrogation away from sensitive topics. Too bad for him that Zorian knew a great deal about what he and his allies had been doing in the past several months. The ritual needs at least 5 shifter children to work. Ideally more. Zorian frowned. 5 children. What happens to them? Alanik asked. Sacrificed, of course, Sudamir said, rolling his eyes. His thoughts told Zorian that he considered that a very stupid question. Ask an obvious question, get an obvious answer. Why so many? Zorian asked. And why children? Why shifter children? There is only so much primordial essence one can extract from any particular shifter, Sudamir said. And that essence gets progressively more integrated into the shifter's body as they age, making it next to impossible to extract. Only very young shifters have any significant amount of free-floating primordial essence in their bodies. What? Explain, Alanik told him. Sudamir sighed. Simply splicing a foreign soul into your own won't make you a shifter. At least, not the kind people are familiar with. A stream of disjointed flashes flew across Sudamir's mind and Zorian dived deeper into his memories to investigate. Sudamir knew this stuff because he had been doing research into shifters for years now. He had captured dozens of shifters, experimenting on them in a brutal fashion to see what makes them tick. He even made several attempts to produce one, the most successful one being his production of the Silver One. Disturbingly, though, the Silver One wasn't a human granted the ability to turn into a winter wolf, but the opposite, he had grafted a human soul onto a winter wolf, granting him increased intelligence and ability to turn human if he so wished. Why would he do such a thing? Zorian took a deep breath and pushed the thought out of his mind. While horrible, Sudamir's shifter experiments were basically a drop in the bucket as far as Sudamir's crimes were concerned. Asking him about it would just waste the little time he had left with the man. In order to make the transformation so flexible and thorough, the ancestors of modern shifters had to use something more, Sudamir continued. Specifically, they used a bit of primordial blood they had recovered from the creature imprisoned beneath Scioria. That particular primordial was noted for its shape-shifting prowess, and thus served as a potent catalyst for their own rituals. It is one of the reasons why their shifter rituals are so hard to acquire for outsiders. Even if they can procure the instructions for the ritual, they still need the blood of an existing shifter to perform it, because they're the only ones with primordial essence coursing through their blood. The cultists want to use that primordial essence as a key to open the prison, Zorian mused out loud. Yes, Sudamir confirmed. Zorian could feel that the man liked talking about this topic, as it shifted the interrogation away from his misdeeds onto someone he didn't much care about. Although he was technically a member of the cult, Sudamir didn't seem to have any emotional attachment to his fellow initiates. In a way, that essence is still a part of the primordial, and can thus be used as a tool for bridging the gap between our world and the pocket dimension where the primordial has been imprisoned. Pocket dimension, huh? Alanik said. That is why they call it a summoning ritual, Sudamir said. Technically, the primordial isn't on the same plane of existence as the rest of us. The gods made a special extra-dimensional prison to shove it into. Such pocket dimensions always have a place where they touch our reality, though, and the cult has long ago found where the anchor point for the prison is. Zorian was forced to terminate the interrogation soon afterwards, but before he did so, he made sure to memory wipe Sudamir of his recent memories. As far as he was concerned, the interrogation had never taken place. As they left, Alanik commented on the fact Zorian was not using any words or gestures to perform his mind magic. His tolerance for Zorian's peculiarities was probably steadily approaching the breaking point, and he would soon demand some kind of explanation. Unfortunate, but the lack of gestures and chants was not something Zorian could fake. He was pretty sure an expert mage like Alanik would notice if he tried to make something up to mask his ability. By the time he'd finally gone back to Scioria, it was already evening and Kiriel was sound asleep. Imaya remained awake to wait for him, which Zorian found a little bizarre. He had already made up an excuse yesterday for the fact that he would be absent for an entire day, and told her not to wait for him. She cared a bit too much about her tenants for a landlord, in his opinion. As he went to bed, he couldn't help but wonder what kind of chaos was going to follow in the wake of the fall of Ayaska Mansion. He supposed he would find out soon. In the next couple of days, Alanik left him alone and refrained from getting him involved in further investigations. That didn't mean that he and the rest of Eldamar's authorities were idle, though in the days that followed, Scioria was rocked by one scandal after another as important people started getting arrested and brought in for questioning left and right. Zorian paid close attention to who was getting arrested, even though he actually already knew most of them due to his interrogation session with Sudamir. Aside from paying attention to the arrests going around him and the reactions they were causing, Zorian also executed several attacks against various Iranian webs to continue accumulating experience needed for interpreting the Matriarch's memory packet. He was good enough at picking his targets at this point that he had few issues with actually subduing Iranian patrols, but he found the experience very draining in an emotional sense. He was basically attacking random Arania for no reason whatsoever, all because he needed a victim to practice his memory reading on, and it was hard not to feel like a villain. Some of the Arania begged him to stop or repeatedly tried to talk to him instead of fighting back. He simply withdrew whenever he encountered such individuals, seeking out more aggressive individuals that actually fought back against his unprovoked aggression, even though that was infinitely more dangerous and definitely not the most efficient strategy. A few days more passed before Alanik had finally contacted him, using a letter, of all things. The message was short, basically telling him that some people were asking about him, but that he was successfully dodging their questions for now. The letter warned Zorian not to draw further attention if he wished to remain anonymous, since people were already interested in him. Fair enough. He had already decided he would terminate the restart in a few more days. He just wanted to wait for a little while longer to see if something interesting would happen, since he didn't think the arrests had reached a critical point yet. By this point Kale had moved into the house and Zorian had already told him about the time loop and given him his research notebooks, so he decided to tell him a little about Sudamir and the information he had learned from the man. He omitted any information about Kale's friends and acquaintances, since the Morlock had told him to keep that secret from him, but that still left a lot of stuff to talk about. Oh. Shifters have the essence of a primordial inside of their bodies? Kale said, surprised. That's what the man said, at least, Zorian nodded. I can't help but wonder how this extraction thing works. Do the cultists really have to kill those kids to get this primordial essence? Almost certainly, Kale nodded. It sounds like it's part of their life force. It would make sense for something that is inherited from parent to child. Regardless of method, removing someone's life force is never benign. Ritual sacrifice is simply the fastest way to perform blood magic on them, but even if the cultists used something fancier, the results would likely be the same. Blood magic? Asked Zorian curiously. You know what that is? Ah, right, you probably don't know. The Mage Guild does tend to suppress that information, doesn't it? Kale mused. Blood magic involves using people's life force, usually to fuel various spells. Life force is really potent, much more so than regular mana, so the temptation is always there. Of course, not only are blood magic rituals incredibly dangerous, using your life force also has terrible effects on the body. Thus, most mages who dabble in it prefer to use other people's life force instead of their own. You know all those stories about villains that ritually sacrifice people for power? They're basically doing blood magic. Oh. So that's blood magic. Kind of underwhelming, Zorian said. I thought it would be something incredibly arcane and sinister, considering how obsessive the Mage Guild is about purging any mention of it from books. Blood magic is very easy to do, so long as you have a steady stream of sacrifices, Kale said. And there is little variation in the amount of life force between different humans. Any random civilian will do as a sacrifice. It's a very quick if bloody road to power, and the Mage Guild is afraid that if the information about blood magic was freely available, you would see blood mages popping up all over the place. I've also heard that blood magic can be used to steal other people's bloodlines and special abilities, and you can imagine how all those super special noble houses would feel about that. The Mage Guild cracks down on it very viciously, and blood magic produces too many victims for a practitioner to hide for long. Before Zorian could continue the conversation, a series of explosions started to erupt across the city, causing them both to run outside to see what was happening. They found the rest of the inhabitants of the house to be unhurt but confused and frightened by the detonations, though Zorian already had a pretty good idea what was happening. His suspicions were confirmed when he climbed to the roof of the house and took a look at the city around them, only to see vast swathes of it burning and many of the streets overrun with war trolls and hostile mages. The Abasins and the Cult of the World Dragon had decided to launch their invasion early. The next several hours were a blur. Though the invaders didn't have the support of Iron Beaks and the undead normally provided by Sudamir, and though Cyoria's forces were far more prepared for foul play this time around, the invaders still had a lot of firepower and did their best to cause huge amounts of damage. Though he wanted to go out and explore this unusual invasion, Zorian couldn't bring himself to abandon the rest of the household alone and undefended to the invaders. Instead he stayed at home, eliminating small groups of invaders that had decided to target this area of the city and occasionally using divination to spy on other parts of the city when things were relatively quiet. Interestingly, despite him eradicating at least 6 battle groups, Quadakikl never showed up to deal with him. Presumably he was a lot busier this time around, and couldn't afford to deal with a minor issue like him. To be honest, he didn't understand what the Abasins were trying to accomplish by launching this premature attack. At least their original plan to attack during the summer festival had a chance to really do some lasting harm to the city, while this one was doomed to fail right from the start. Then again, maybe they didn't have much choice. They surely knew by now that Eldamar's investigators were onto them, so waiting for the summer festival was clearly stupid, but with Ayaska Mansion shut down, perhaps retreating to Ulquin Abasa in a timely manner was impossible. After a while, his scrying attempts noticed that fighting was especially fierce around the hole. This was where most of the invading forces were concentrated, and Quadakikl never seemed to move far from the place. Were the invaders gambling everything on the successful summoning of the primordial? It certainly seemed so. A part of him wondered if that meant Nachka had been kidnapped and was being ritually sacrificed as he watched, but he pushed that thought aside. He couldn't do anything about it, even if she was, and she would be alive when the next restart begins. It was interesting, though. If the cultists successfully released the primordial from its extradimensional prison, he would finally be able to see for himself how dangerous and destructive it was. The restart wasn't even close to ending, after all, so the primordial would have plenty of time to show its might. Hours ticked by and Zorian suddenly realized this was it. The fighting around the hole had reached a fevered pitch, with Eldamar's soldiers frantically trying to surge forward and overrun the invaders while Quadakikl rained a dizzying variety of suppressive fire on the forces arrayed against him. At some point one of Cyoria's mages actually managed to melt half of his skull off with some kind of golden fire, which was the first time Zorian had ever seen something do actual damage to the ancient lich, but that didn't seem to hold him back much. Above the hole, and presumably on the inside of it, space shuddered and writhed, distorting everything like hot summer air. Slowly, jagged black threads started rising into the air from the depths, zigzagging through the air and occasionally forking offshoots. They were cracks, Zorian realized. Reality was breaking. Suddenly, a huge volume of space in the center of the crack simply caved in, creating a pitch-black hole that hung in the air. Something huge and dark brown, like a hand studded with mouths and eyes, shot out of the rip in space, but Zorian didn't have time to study it much. Without any prompting from him, the marker on his soul suddenly activated and everything went black. He woke up in his bed in Siren, with Kiriel wishing him a good morning. With a sigh, Zorian helped Kiriel unload her luggage from the train, his mind still on the events of the previous restart. Why did the time loop restart when it did? Was it because Zack just happened to die at that point, or was it like Zorian suspected because the primordial was successfully released into the world? What kind of relationship did the primordial have with the time loop? Was the whole point of the time loop to prevent its release? He wondered whether the time loop ended, and it usually did because a month was how long a default restart lasted, or because that's when the primordial was usually released and he never bothered to stop the ritual until now. Welcome to Cyoria, Kiri, he told her. Pretty impressive, isn't it? He was cheating, of course. He knew that Kiriel found Cyoria's central train station impressive. This time, though, something else seemed to have attracted her attention. She said, pointing behind him. I think that guy wants to talk to you. Zorian turned around, only to see a pissed-off-looking Zack stomping towards him. Zorian was so shocked at the sight that he didn't move at all until the boy was practically in his face. He opened his mouth to give him an awkward hello, but before he could say anything, Zach's fist shot forward in a blur and punched him in the face.